Hello world and welcome to episode 9 of What Does This Knob Do? We are approaching the end of the series on oscillators for VCV Rack. Then I actually presented all currently available oscillators, if I have them. Some of the paid modules are missing. I will submit them as soon as I have them. And of course, new modules will be added over and over again. And of course, I will introduce them as well. Now, however, I continue with developers with the letter S. Sonus Modular has 5 candidates in the race. Addiction is an additive sine wave oscillator, or actually 16 oscillators. Its frequency spectrum ranges from 16.3 Hz to 4009 Hz. With octave control, it can be tuned in the range of ±3 octaves. It has 1 volt per octave input and only 1 output. It has 4 identical rows, each consisting of a harmonic and the intervals of the minor and major third and the perfect fifth. Each of these oscillators has a volume control, and this can also be controlled via CV. The basic tones are C3, C4, G4 and C5. By increasing or decreasing single oscillators, you can build different chords or intervals. The drone is absolutely identical in appearance. Its frequency range is also identical. Here we have a harmonic and first, second and third overtone, which corresponds to 2 times, 3 times and 4 times the fundamental frequency and is therefore called this way. Basic tones are C2, C3, G3 and C4. The fundamental tone is in any case a pure sine wave. The harmonics contain a kind of phase modulation. Here too the sound is generated by increasing and decreasing the harmonics. Does not sound so much like a chord due to the phase modulation and the other intervals. And it should sound more like drone, and it does so especially in low registers, and it is a perfect addition to Addiction. Chainsaw is not satisfied with one oscillator either. Its range goes from C1 to C7, but can be detuned by ±1 octave for each of the 3 oscillators. Especially the fine-tuning is important if you have 3 identical oscillators. This makes everything possible from a slide sweep to a supersaw. Very interesting is also the shape control, which makes the waveform and the sound rounder when turned to the left and sharper when turned to the right. Oscillator 2 and 3 can also be synchronized with oscillator 1 at the push of a button. Unfortunately, it only lasts as long as the button is pressed. Fortunately, it has a CV in, and so this can be controlled by an external trigger and can be permanent with a fixed voltage, e.g. by the Mark I trigger of AS. The knobs, shape and tune also have CV inputs. But for an oscillator that calls itself Chainsaw, it is a bit too nice for me and needs some distortion. As for example, his colleague Death Crush. Octagon is actually an LFO with 8 different phases, which all have the same frequency because there is only one frequency control, but a phase shifted by 45 degrees, whereby the waveforms are not congruent and start at different times, as you can see here very nicely at the flashing lights of the cables. A slider changes the mode to oscillator, and here we have a sine wave. The shifted phase only becomes noticeable when several phases are used simultaneously, because the frequencies of the phases then influence each other. The tonal range extends from C2 to C6 and can also be controlled via CV. This socket also serves as volt per octave input. Oscillum is also called unusual oscillator. In any case, the possibilities for sound shaping are unusual. Except for an octave control, which allows a tuning between C1 and C7, nothing can be influenced. It has 4 outputs, labeled wave 1 to 4, and these waveforms are all different. From 1 to 4, the number of harmonics increases, and with it the timbre becomes brighter. In my opinion, this oscillator almost screams for the possibility of mixing the waveforms in a flexible ratio and then outputting them as an overall signal. This can be achieved, e.g. with an attenuator, here the 8-word or fundamental, and the sum or merge module, here the sum Mark II of ML modules, which can also reverse the polarity, and the sound becomes more interesting. But that's a nice thing about modular systems. You just need a starting point to shape the sound further with other modules. Sonos Modular goes its own way with its oscillators. They provide interesting base material, which needs to be formed further. The circle VCO from Seoul also wants to be formed further and therefore brings the corresponding material with it. Because in itself it doesn't offer much. Its frequency range goes from 11.6 Hz to 6300 Hz, and it produces a sine wave, a cosine wave, thus a sine shifted by 45 degrees, and a sawtooth, here called ramp. Then there's a volt per octave input, and that's it. But that's where his 2 colleagues come in. Modulo folds the input signal, whereby staircase is a coarser convolution, and wrapped allows fine nuances. With gain, you can adjust the intensity of the convolution, and this can be controlled by CV. If we also bring in the wrapping comparator, the sound becomes even more versatile. Offset is used to set the phase, and this can also be controlled via CV. Range refers to the range in which the 2 underlying controllers become active. These modulate the range or compare its signal with the input signal and output this value at the output. No matter which input signal comes from the circle VCO, the result is always a square wave, but with different pulse width, and these can be controlled or shaped by CV at different points. And the circle VCO has its name because of its representation in lithogyou mode of an oscilloscope, here full scope of JW modules. With these 3 modules you can also create wonderful graphics. The whole thing is called Oscilloscope Music, and you can find a link under the video. I find the whole thing very exciting, and we'll deal with it even more closely. But also the sound possibilities are quite good. Annuli from South Pole once again corresponds to a module from Mutable Instruments for the Euro Rack, namely rings. And there is also another version for VCV Rack, namely resonator from Audible Instruments. Interestingly, this was not displayed as an oscillator, but since it corresponds to annuli, I introduce it here. Let's start with the entrances. Each of the 5 knobs has its own CV input and an associated attenuator. Besides the usual volt per octave input for a CV signal, there is a strum input for a trigger signal and the in input for an audio signal. Ideally, a signal should be present at all 3. The strum signal only works in polyphonic mode. Here the sounding voice freezes for a moment, it fades away, a new signal starts on the next voice. This creates the effect of strings or other resonance bodies struck shortly after each other. The signal in excites the resonator to sound. The module has 2 outputs, whereby in polyphonic mode the even harmonics are output on one and the odd harmonics on the other. I just mentioned the polyphony mode. The module can be operated in 3 different modes. Green LED corresponds to 1 voice, yellow LED to 2 voices, and red LED to 4 voices. For these modes there are also 3 variants of resonators. Green corresponds to a modal resonator, which simulates some frequencies being raised and others being damped, as when striking one string or another resonance body. Yellow corresponds to sympathetic strings, which simulates the resonance of unattached strings or resonating bodies, e.g. harmonics. Red LED corresponds to modulated or inharmonic strings. This is a classic Kaplan-Strong synthesis, that is, the excitation signal is sent to a comp filter with an absorption filter that simulates the multiple reflection of a wave that results from the vibration of a string and that is absorbed at its end. However, this is extended by a delay-compensated all-pole absorption filter for more drastic plucking effects. Delay time modulation modeled after the sound of instruments with a curved bridge such as sitar or tempura, and all-pass filters in the delay loop that shift the position of the partials and simulate the tension of a piano string, and inharmonic tones. The basic frequency is set in a range of 5 octaves via frequency. The function of structure depends on the choice of resonator. In the modal resonator, it determines the frequency ratio between the partial tones. In sympathetic strings mode, this parameter controls the frequency ratios between all strings. If modulated inharmonic strings is active, this parameter controls the amount of modulation and detuning of the partials. Brightness adjusts the level of higher harmonics in the signal by the simultaneous effect of a low-pass filter on the exciter signal and the attenuator filter on the rest of the potentiometer. Low values simulate materials such as wood or nylon. High values simulate materials such as glass or steel. Damping controls the cooldown of the sound. Position controls to which point of the string phase the excitation is applied. Applying the excitation in the middle of the surface will cause the even harmonics to cancel each other out, resulting in a hollow sound reminiscent of a square wave. This reminds a bit of PWM or calm filter effects. As always, there are a few special features hidden in the context menu. On the one hand, we have the mode FM voice, which allows typical FM sounds a la DX7. Quantized sympathetic strings is a variant of the sympathetic strings in which only tones that match the fundamental tone are heard. Reverb strings is a subtype of modulated enharmonic strings with a high reverb content. And then there's disastrous piece mode. This was originally an Easter egg from Mutable Instruments, which was not so easy to activate. In the VCV Rack versions, however, it can be easily activated in the context menu, and we hear an organ sound. Annuli also changes its name and the name of the controls, which makes it much easier to work with this mode. Odd, even and volt per octave are the same. In becomes FX in, and an effect or modulation signal can be inserted here. Strum becomes env trick, and the internal envelope is triggered again at each trigger pulse. The polyphony button becomes chord size, but it seems to have no effect. Instead of the resonator versions, we only have different effect types: formant filters, chorus and reverb, whose power is controlled by FX amount. Frequency becomes a root node, which defines the root node of the chord. Using structure chord type, we set the distribution of the tones within the chord. Registration simulates different registers of an organ and thereby changes the timbre, i.e. also what brightness did before. Decay attack is responsible for the decay and swelling of the sound, and finally FX amount for the influence of the selected effect on the sound. Disastrous piece is a nice encore, but actually it doesn't fit with the rest. Annuli or resonator is a module for all sounds created by a form of vibration, be it strings, fur or solid surfaces. And it's just great at that. For me, one of the best modules in VCV Rack. Squinky Labs is also a developer of extraordinary modules. The functional VCO is not so special in principle. It is simply a variant of the VCO1 from Fundamental, which needs much less CPO and therefore a good and important module. Everything else is absolutely identical, so I give myself the further introduction and refer to my corresponding video. The Chebyshev Wave Shaper is not yet officially available as I make this video. Therefore, many thanks to Bruce Fraser, who made it available to me in advance for this episode. Chebyshev polynomials enable the digital generation of waveforms with any overtone structure at very low computing power. In this module, the first 10 Chebyshev polynomials are used to generate the first 10 harmonics of the harmonic series. The oscillator has a frequency range of 16.4 Hz to 8820 Hz With a fine-tune control, you can even reach 14,700 Hz. Initialized, it shows C5, so that is already 2 octaves above most other modules. The preset button allows you to switch between 3 settings. 1. Adding all harmonics, and 1 setting all but the fundamental to 0. The third setting is always the last one you used. The proportion of the individual polynomials is determined by the small black knobs and can also be controlled by CV. This alone allows for very lively sounds, but as always, it only becomes really exciting with a modulation. The mod controller is assigned to the corresponding socket and enables exponential frequency modulation. The LFM controller, including socket, linear frequency modulation. The gain control is responsible for the wave shaping and has 2 modes, fold and clip. If the LED of the slider is off or green, there is no difference between the 2 modes. If you turn the gain control up until the LED is red, you can hear and see very clear differences. Clip simply cuts off the signal, while fold is folding the frequencies. The even and odd controls are used to set the proportion of even and odd harmonics. Slope controls the fading out of high harmonics. Both slope and gain can be controlled via CV, and all harmonics can be controlled via the EG socket. An external signal can be inserted into the X-in input, which then runs through the wave shaper instead of the internal VCO. Especially with a modulation, Chebyshev shows what he is capable of. Even in initialized mode, a modulation with caudal from volt is enough to teach Chebyshev how to speak. If even and odd could now also be regulated by CV, that would be the greatest thing. Maybe there will be an update. But even so, the sound is convincing all along the line and is extremely versatile. At first glance, the oscillators from Submarine are frightening, but on closer inspection they are not complicated at all. The PO101 has a frequency range of 11.6 Hz to 6300 Hz and can be detuned by ±3 half steps with fine. It offers sine, triangle, sawtooth, square and rectified sine waveforms. It has 1 volt per octave input and 20 outputs. 16 of these have solid phases and 4 adjustable phases, which can also be controlled by CV. The solid phases are on the one hand at a distance of 15 degrees and on the other hand there is another phase after every 22.5 degrees. As with all oscillators with several phases, this is of course only heard when several phases are used simultaneously. Especially because of the 4 free phases and the possibility to control them with a controller, interesting sounds are possible. The PO102 is absolutely identical except for its frequency spectrum, which is why it is primarily an LFO. We already experienced the PO204 in the very cool patch contest number 1. Its frequency spectrum ranges from 1.4 Hz to 6300 Hz, which is why it can be used both as VCO and LFO. It can also be detuned by ±3 half steps with fine. It has only one oscillator but 4 outputs at which different signals can be tapped. Every signal can have a different waveform: sine, sawtooth, rectified sine, triangle and square, and these can be traversed continuously, and this can be controlled by CV. Each of the 4 voices can have a different phase, and this is also infinitely adjustable via CV. In addition, each signal can be multiplied up to 16 times, which increases the frequency. This can also be controlled by CV, but here the steps are clearly audible. Also here I miss a summing output, for which I can regulate the ratio of the individual voices, but also here one can make do with an attenuator and summing module. And that was episode 9, again with some very interesting modules. Next week, as announced, the last episode with oscillators for the time being. Then we'll continue with filters. As always, you will find links to the most important websites and also to the developers of the modules presented this time. I am looking forward to your feedback, no matter if wishes, suggestions or criticism. And not to forget, many thanks to Andrew Belt and all the module developers without whom this would not be possible. That's it from me, have a good time, servus!